From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So good afternoon. I'm Beverly Brannon, one of 3 photo curators in the Princeton Photographs Division of the Library of Congress. One of my specialties is photojournalism, so I am really delighted to welcome you here today. We are gathered to celebrate the gift to the library of more than 100 photographs of the Spanish Civil War from Ben Schneiderman and his sister, Helen Sarid, on this, the 103rd birthday of their uncle, David Seymour, also known as Shem. Shem was one of the most accomplished photographers of the 20th century. Please join me in thanking Ben and Helen for making this special event possible. Shem's pictures will feel very much at home here at the library. The Princeton Photographs Division has one of the largest collections of news photography in the world, dating from some of the earliest war photographs, Roger Fenton's own prints of the Crimean War in the 1850s, through the largest body of original photography for the American Civil War, and the archives of many 20th century newspapers, magazines, and photojournalists. While the library already had some photographic documentation of the Spanish Civil War, there were no works by its best-known photojournalists, David Seymour, Robert Capa, and Gerda Taro. So we are especially pleased to have this splendid addition to the National Picture Collection. Thank you. Ben asked me to speak about how the library does its magic of sharing these photographs with the wider world. So here's what happened, bringing in the Shem photographs from the den in Ben's apartment to the stacks of the Library of Congress. When Ben first offered this generous gift, my fellow photo curator, Verna Curtis, and I visited him 4 times to make selections. After we analyzed how the photos would fit with the library's existing resources for the study of Spanish Civil War and photojournalism, we recommended that the library accept his offer with alacrity and goodwill. We then had the photographs digitized to meet federal standards so they could be posted on the library's website for research purposes. The library has an extensive digitization program. Of the 15 million items in the division, 1.5 million can be viewed online as part of our mandate to provide access to information to the public. Some of the images we received, or once the images were received, they went to the cataloging team for description and indexing. Some of the prints had been press prints previously, had been used at several magazines and newspapers, and each had its own caption, crop marks, and usage information. Sometimes they had conflicting information, but all of that is now recorded in the catalog record for you to see. We rely on the object as the authority for our statements about each piece, and if researchers alert us to new information, we'll change the record and cite the source. With this project, we went an extra mile. We created an online overview to provide context for Shem's work, and we made a reference aid to make it easier to locate Spanish Civil War resources in all formats. Did I mention that this is the largest library in the world? So reference aids that point to books, newspapers, maps, movies, music, posters, and photographs on any given topic are valuable pathfinders. Please log in to loc.gov/pictures to see what we found, and visit the display next door at the end of this program to see original objects and talk to the specialists there. So the library's magic works in two ways. Not only does the library preserve original historical documents, including Shim's photographic prints, but it also makes these valuable works of art and history available to a multidisciplinary, international audience through its online catalog records that facilitate the exploration of ideas through many different kinds of information sources. We have a wealth of speakers today, so we'll move directly to the presentations. First is Juan Manuel Perez. He is a specialist from the Hispanic Division who has extensive expertise in both European and South American history. With this background, he is well-versed to set the stage for the Spanish Civil War by describing the political ideas that led up to the hostilities. Juan Manuel?
Thank you. I must apologize about my voice. I'm still fighting a bronchitis have been fighting a bronchitis for the last couple of weeks. The Spanish Civil War is considered a prelude to the Second World War because all the elements that were present in the Second World War were present in the Spanish Civil War: communism, fascism, democracy, but also the Civil War had its own characteristics, meaning that it was also kind of like a religious war and a class war, and it represented centuries of resentment towards the power of the Catholic Church and the upper classes. And there was a deep polarization of the political spectrum. There was no middle ground. And all of this contributed to social and political unrest, like, for example, the miners' strike in Asturias in 1934. And there were many groups, many factions. You have the military, the church, the upper classes, the lower classes, socialists, communists, phalangists, anarchists, Carlists, and all of them with all their own particular agendas and fighting against each other. It was one of the bloodiest civil wars with almost 500,000 casualties. And it was also a media war, as it will be explained later. For example, aside from the numerous photographs, leaders in both sides tried to use the power of the media for their own purposes. Like, for example, General Capo de Llano on Franco's side will have a sort of like a tertulia every day talking about the war. And those would appear later, those talks would appear later in newspapers, and they were read most often also in schools. My father told me that when he was growing up, his professor would always have the latest report from General Capo de Llano, and he would read it to the class. It was also an international war. Fighters from all over the world flooded to Spain. And I guess it's because there are so many different elements. The Spanish Civil War has attracted and continues to attract the interest of researchers. In my own experience, I can tell you that in my division, we have had researchers from the Middle East who were interested in studying the foreign fighters who fought in Spain, perhaps as to whether to learn from it or even to draw parallels with the current conflicts in Iraq and in Syria. And with the opening of the archives in Spain, and also with the fall of the Soviet Union, we are getting new insights about the conflict. In fact, I would say in Spain, the best histories of the Civil War have been written after the death of Franco, because during the dictatorship, since there was a lot of censorship, not many historians attempted to write about the conflict, unless, of course, you were a supporter of the regime. Archives were close to independent researchers. The collections that we have here at the library are considered to be perhaps some of the, or one of the finest collections about the Spanish Civil War outside Spain. For the Civil War itself, it's over 2,000 volumes. And then if we add the period of 1931 to 1939, which is the period of the Second Republic, you can add perhaps 1,500 more volumes. And we have not only books, but also many different materials in a variety of formats. We have manuscripts, newspapers, we even have a recording of a broadcast by Pope Pius XI to broadcast over Vatican Radio broadcast. It was his welcoming remarks to a group of Spanish priests and nuns who were fleeing the war. We also have papers of General Miaja, who was in charge of the defense of Madrid. Whenever I'm asked to talk about the Spanish collections, I always like to mention one very, very, very unique item, and that is a poem that Pablo Neruda, the Chilean writer, dedicated to Spain. It was called España en el Corazón, and it was published in Spain in 1938. Maybe about 100 copies were made, and only about 3 or 4 survive, and we have, and our copy is one of those that has survived. But it is said that the materials used, that's why it's so unique, the materials used to make the paper came from the uniforms and shirts of Republican soldiers who died in a battle. And this is just an example of the uniqueness of what we have here at the library. And of course, needless to say, the addition of these photographs will enrich even more the collections of what we already have. I forgot to mention, we also have 123 original Civil War posters, and they're online. And if you have the chance, just spend 10 or 15 minutes going through them. Most of them are from the Republican side, but you also find some that were from the nationalist or rebel side, and they're just beautiful. Just going through those posters, I think you probably will be able to get an idea of what the Civil War was all about, and the different ideals that people fought and died for in that conflict. So I hope you will enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and you can go ahead and later look at the exhibit that we have prepared for you. And thank you very much.
We have tried to put a variety of those posters on display, so we're not trying to take sides. So our next speaker is Tom Beck. Tom is both a curator and an art professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and a faculty member at the Corcoran College of Art and Design of George Washington University. He has written extensively about photography, curated many exhibits, and received many grants. Today, he will distill what he has learned from writing his 2005 David Seymour biography, His talk is titled David Seymour, Photographer and Humanist.
Thank you, Beverly. Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here. Thank you, Beverly, for organizing this, and I'd like to recognize my colleague, Verna Curtis, curator at the Princeton Photographs Division as well. David Seymour is one of my favorite topics to speak about, of course, and my title, as you see, is David Seymour, one of the world's great photographers and humanists. And I'd like to answer two questions. The first is, why was Shim one of the world's great photographers and humanists, and what makes one a great photographer and humanist? So, let's see, go forward. So in just 10 minutes, I'm going to provide the answers to these questions. Henri Cartier-Bresson, another of the world's great photographers, described his friend Shim as having the intelligence of a chess player and the air of a math teacher who applied his vast curiosity and culture to a great number of subjects. As a person and as a photographer, Shim was a rationalist and a thinker. While his images had much sentiment in them, they were by no means sentimental. Emotion and intellect were entirely in balance. Aesthetics abounded in his work. Just look at the similarity of the angles in this image and think of the previous one of the chessboard. Shim was educated at Leipzig's Staatliche Akademie für Grafische Künste und Buchgewerbe, State Academy for Graphic Arts and Book Technology, where he not only learned book design and production, but also came into contact with modernist aesthetic ideas such as constructivism, which was an art movement that originated in Russia and had paid homage to geometry, scientific rationality, and abstraction. All words that I think describe the work of David Seymour. Shim drew upon his aesthetic background in making images such as this one of the Mexican oil refinery. From his earliest images, children became Shim's primary subject matter. The Great Depression curtailed his studies at the Sorbonne, and he needed income. He borrowed a camera from a family friend and produced a portfolio with which to get freelance jobs. This image of the children is part of that early portfolio. As a photographer, Shim was both reacted to the what is of the world as well as directed his subjects. In either approach, he exerted his humanist concerns as the underpinning of the imagery. In this photograph, he takes a slightly angular look at children on the street with special interest in their faces. Now, humanism had its origins in the Renaissance, during which time scholars labeled the study of grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy as studia humanitatis. Humanist scholars were particularly interested in studying the classical literature of Greece and Rome in search for an ideal for human life. In a sense, Shim was pursuing metaphorically such an ideal in his imagery, and to a certain extent, he found it in the children that he photographed. Spanish Civil War. Now, there's a great topic. Shim was a man of peace, but his life was yet shaped by war. World War I, the Spanish Civil War, World War II, and the Suez Crisis. Not surprisingly, he turned away from photographing war itself to picturing instead humanity affected by it while trying to go about their lives. He rejected recording the hellish and deathly look of war. He left that to Robert Capa. Shim showed in his photographs not just a few works of a humanistic nature, but a pattern of humanistic values over an entire career. Among those values was a fundamental respect for human life and for humanity. In this image, he got down on his knee to the eye level of the child and made the image. His strategy was advantageous not only to avoid intimidating the child, but also to show the child as an individual. In Shim's case, photography and humanism were one and the same. The imagery was about specific children, but it was also symbolic of all children for whom play, even under extreme circumstances of a displaced person's shelter, prepared them for life. Humanism celebrates human beings and their creative works, is a reminder of what human beings can achieve, and is therefore positive and optimistic. Shim showed the reality of the aftermath of war, but always looked to a brighter future. A very optimistic fellow, I believe. He understood the symbol-making capacity of photography and knew which strategies would produce the strongest imagery. Though this image of a baby was surely arranged, the strength of its symbolic and humanistic statement is intensified through the arrangement. Humanistic imagery typically shows people in the process of being human. It's not an end result. It's an ongoing and delightful process. This photograph of 4-year-old Eleftheria shows her with her very first pair of shoes. Shim delivered the shoes to Eleftheria for UNICEF. And when they were put on the girl's feet, she looked at them with curiosity, then ran through the village laughing with delight. Shim said her happiness was absolutely perfect. No better statement, I think, can be made about that result. This was for Shim the celebration of Eleftheria's humanity and revealed the excitement that he had in witnessing and photographing this new phase of her life. Shim was a passionate image maker, but not an aggressive one. His light touch was poetic in the greatest tradition of the humanities. In this image, the boy walking carefree through an alley in Mykonos is a touching event, but capturing the boy's arm extended makes it pure photographic poetry. Photographing was a calling for Shim, but it was also an enterprise. He made a living from his pictures. It was not the original plan. The original plan was for him to join the family publishing business, but the Depression changed all of that. Photographing Sophia Loren was part of the enterprise. However, the result was far more than the job he was sent to do. On a break in the photo session, Shim made this image which says much about Loren as a person rather than as an aspiring actress that she was then. His image did not dwell on her sensuality, but rather on the humanity found in her response to the situation. Shim's first war coverage was the Spanish Civil War, where he pioneered fast-action battle photography. 20 years later, he returned to war photography to what in the West is called the Suez Crisis, and in the East is called the Egyptian War. His images were not so much about the inhumanity of war as the humanity of the people just trying to cope with circumstances. This was one of Shim's last photographs. In conclusion, Shim was one of the finest photographers in the world because he knew how to make aesthetically engaging images that drew upon his artistic background. He was one of the eminent humanists of the world because he applied his rationalist approach to making images in search of a metaphorical idea for human life. Photography and humanism were one and the same for him. In short, he was one of the world's great photographers and humanists. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Now we're going to turn to Carol Nagar. Carol Nagar has worked in the creative arts for decades. She is co-founder and special projects editor of Pixel Press and has contributed frequently to Aperture Photography magazine. since 1988. She has written about Hungarian-American photographer Marion Palfi and about Swedish photographer Christer Stromholm, as well as Shim. Her talk today is David Seymour, The Lives of Shim.
Hello. When Ben Schneiderman asked me about 10 years ago to write about Shim, I was excited, but I soon became frustrated because Shim was a bit of a mystery man. We couldn't find anything pertaining to his lives. No letters, very few telegrams, a few press cards, a few family photographs. But one day, a few years later, Ben came with a big smile on his face to New York with a huge file that he had found while Jenny and him were moving from one house to the other in the back of a closet. And in this file was 600 documents pertaining to Shim's life. Letters written to his family in Polish and in Spanish and in French, photographs, telegrams, press cards, everything, a biographer's treasure. And then, just on the heels of that discovery, came the Mexican suitcase, which is neither Mexican nor a suitcase, but 3 boxes of boiled cardboards that were actually found in Mexico that had 3,000 films rolled up, and inside all the captions pertaining to the Spanish Civil War. So with these 2 treasures, I was ready to start my voyage of discovery. Robert Capa said that Shim was the real photographer. It's him, the real photographer. And for a long time, he was undervalued, but now he's really coming into his own, and everybody is starting to get interested. So Shim started his life in Warsaw as the son of a publisher, and I chose to write about him in an essay, a biographical essay called Lives of Shim in the plural, because he seemed to sum up the lives of all these exile photographers and writers and intellectuals that ended up having more than one life, going all over Europe and photographing a huge variety of subjects. He truly seemed to have more than one life, like a cat. So we are waiting for Shim to be born in November 1911. Yeah, it was found in the closet of the hair of a Mexican General Aguilar. Apparently, Capa's printer, Chicky Weiss, a Hungarian, had carried all of the boxes to Bordeaux on his bike at the beginning of at the end of the Spanish Civil War, and he had tried to find somebody who would be able to carry them safely away from France, because he was afraid that the photographs would be destroyed. So these were carried by our General Aguilar, and then sent to his, and then his heir, who is a Mexican cinematographer, got the pictures, and they stayed in his closet for many years, another closet, another mystery. And then finally he realized what he had, and after a few tractations, very long discussions, they finally arrived at ICP a few years back, and they were the subject of a big exhibition that is still traveling, that went to New York, Paris, and all over the world. Yeah, he was really a Dawid Szymin, which is a Polish Jewish name. And when he arrived in Paris, originally to study at the Sorbonne, after a few months, his family didn't have the means to support him anymore because of the situation, the Great Depression and the situation of the Jews in Poland. So he went to see a family friend who had a press agency called RAP, Rappaport, who loaned him a camera, and he taught himself photography. And then he started to work with Regard, and he decided that his name was too complicated. So he shortened it to Shim, maybe in a way to distance himself from his past, but also just as a signature. And at the time, the photographs were often not signed, but slowly photographers started to have more of a place. They were not only illustrating the editor's ideas, but they were artists on their, in their own. So Shim was born. And then the other name, David Seymour, he took on in 1942 when he became an American citizen during World War II, while he was working as a picture decipherer. He's one of the persons who prepared the landings in Normandy by deciphering images and helping out with information. And in 1947, Shim was one of the 4 photographers with Henri Cartier-Bresson, Robert Capa, and George Roger, the Brit, to found Magnum Photos. And he was also a president twice. He was also the man who drew the bylines. Cartier-Bresson always told me that without Shim, Magnum would not have existed, because he's the one who was the solid voice of reason in the heated discussions that arose between the photographers. But he had a dual personality. He was both reasonable and emotional, and he held his emotion in rein, but you could see the power of them, especially in his Civil War photographs. He was focusing on the civilian population rather than the war itself. So this is Shim as he arrived in Paris. This is on his identity card from the Sorbonne. He's always formal. He's wearing a suit, and he will always do so. He will rarely take off the jacket, except maybe in these heated discussions at Magnum. And this is the famous file that Ben brought to New York in his arms, very happy and very excited, and that contained all the documents that helped us establish the particulars of his life. This is again Shim in Paris. This is one of the last photographs of Shim in Poland in their country house in Otwock with his sister and his father. His sister was always, Hala, was always a very important part of his life, and he always asked her for advice and wrote her all through his life. This is one of Shim's photographs of the Front Populaire, the coalition between all the leftist parties in France in the 1930s that led to very violent demonstrations opposing the left and the right, with a lot of dead. A lot of police brutality. He reported on that. This is one of his most peaceful reports on the fisherman in Brittany. You see he's wearing the clogs and the fisherman's sweater. This is at the Père Lachaise during a demonstration. And these are all the intellectuals that were gathered to fight fascism. It was a committee. You see André Malraux on the right, who had just published Hope, his famous novel. Another demonstration photograph. And one of the very few action photographs in the Spanish Civil War. It was told that Shim didn't photograph action, but it is not true. He was very capable of doing it. However, he realized very soon that the Spanish Civil War was the first war where civilians were targeted, ending infamously with Guernica. And so he focused on the children and the women and their everyday life during the war. This is a young little Republican wearing the hat of the Siderurgy Union. And this is another action photograph. He was really objective. He didn't hesitate to document the most ugly side of the Republicans, who at the beginning were destroying churches. And later on, they turned around and they took good care of the works of art, but in the beginning they were really killing and destroying. This is one of my favorite photographs, maybe, of the Spanish Civil War. This destroyed typewriter on this pedestal of concrete with all the debris and little pieces in the background, looking like maybe a Picasso sculpture or a John Chamberlain assemblage. And you do not know if this is a cenotaph to a dead writer or if this is an homage to the writers who worked in the Spanish Civil War. You have to know that Shim typed himself a lot of the captions and the stories that he reported on. So this was a really important symbolic object. It's been shown recently in the big Louvre Lens show, The Disasters of War. This is Shim in the Spanish Civil War in 1937. These are his papers. And this is also something that he did that was really unusual. He photographed the Moroccan soldiers that were hired by Franco to fight against the Republican. And this is a soldier that was a prisoner and who was probably very relieved not to find himself on the first row, because Franco did lots of promises to the regulares indigenas, as they were called, but he didn't hold his promises and they were killed by the thousands in the war. This is the famous Mexican Suitcase. You could see in the top all the captions written by hand, and in the bottom the celluloid films that were treated in Rochester with a special machine, unspooled so that they wouldn't break, and then scanned so that they could be exhibited. And they were impeccable. They were in an impeccable state after 70 years. But unfortunately, the famous picture of the falling soldier by Capa was not among those. More Republicans, another picture of the regulares, Republicans. One of the photographs of soldiers, and the swastika is in fact a Basque symbol. It is not the fascist symbol you would think it is. The famous Telmon Brigade, among the very many foreign volunteers that joined the Spanish Civil War from more than 30 countries. And a mass at the front in the Basque Country. And that the image that Tom showed with the woman breastfeeding and listening. Georges Soria, who was the journalist with Shim in that reportage, said that nowhere but in Spain are crowds listening to the orators with such concentration and dedication. And this is the contact sheet. It is showing that he first sees this woman from the top while he's standing near the orator, and then he goes down into the crowd and he focuses on her. He works a little bit like a movie maker. And there are only 6 of these images of this contact sheet left. In 1938, the Republicans had lost. Shim made very melancholy images at the Pertuis of the 500,000 Republicans crossing into France, where they were treated very badly and ended up in camps that were no better than concentration camps. And then he took the boat SS Anaya to Veracruz. Mexico was one of the very few cities that countries that took in the refugees and gave them the nationality. And this is some of the people aboard the SS Anaya that he photographed. And going back to Poland, this is one of the last images of his family. His father on the left, his sister in the middle, his mother on the right, standing in their house in Odvodsk. One of the letters that he sent from the war. And this is probably one of the last images of his family where they are wearing the star, the Jewish star on their arm, and they would not survive the war. They were killed at Otvosk, or maybe taken to Treblinka, it is unclear. But he would learn about it only in 1945. Another of his letters. These have all been translated, and you can find them on the davidseymour.com site. And this is Shim's photograph of the ovens at Dachau. Some of his very cold, chilling photographs. And the trial of Nuremberg. And on the top you see a caricature that was done of Shim aboard the SS Sinaya, where he was with a lot of artists and intellectuals, and they had produced a little Roneo-typed magazine aboard. And there were, theater plays and all sorts of things. The triumphal arrival in Mexico, and some of his pictures from Mexico ordered by the president. And his papers, his insurance papers. So during the war, Shim worked in several camps and then in Medmenham near London to decipher photographs. And then in 1947, he was given his first assignment after the war by This Week to go back to where the Allies had fought. This is an earlier photograph of Cartier-Bresson and Shim in Paris on the 14th of July. And this is the wedding of Suzy Marquis, who was Kappa's cousin, and Shim, who was a very generous man, paid for the luncheon, for the wedding luncheon. He's in the back, behind the woman with the hat. That's Shim and Kappa, and that's also a Magnum meeting. Ernst Haas standing, and an early Paris photograph. This is the beginning of his famous reportage on the children that was sponsored by UNICEF in 1948, called Children of Europe. And this is him on the ghetto in Warsaw, where only a few buildings were still standing, and he followed some school children. This is Vienna in the ruins. The cover of his book, Children of Europe, published by UNESCO. And one of the wonderful photographs he made in Naples in an orphanage of a young woman who had been raped during the war. And the reconstruction with the children working in printing plants. A prostitute near the Essen factories. And this is very typical of Shim. He photographs a boy who was really wounded badly during the war, probably collecting unexploded obus, I forget the name in English, but he was in an orphanage in Rome, and he's laughing. And this is from the book with the kids playing the court. The Courrier de l'UNESCO with that says an immense unhappiness, the children of Europe. And the famous photograph of Tereshka, who was asked to draw her house and who could only come up with this scribble. It's been speculated that she was Jewish and was in a camp, but we really don't know anything about Tereshka. And nobody so far was able to locate her, if she's still alive. Brandenburg, Berlin, the Nuremberg trial, a girl in a hospital in Vienna, homemade doll, And one photograph that really represents hunger. The Warsaw Ghetto, with in the back the St. Nicholas Church that was on the very street where Szym and his family lived. These were taken in Odvodsk. And there's an amazing story. When Szym arrived in the country house where he had spent all his summer vacations, he found that it had been transformed into an orphanage for Jewish children. So he photographed there in his own living room. And the kids outside. Some Greek orphans of the Civil War. I'm going a bit fast because I think I'm over my time. This is one of the photographs that I discovered that had not been published in Children of Europe, so I did another book on Szym's children that had some unknown images, because the UNESCO images he chose were mainly to illustrate UNESCO's mission. But this one that has a very Szym sense of humor was not included in the book. The orphanage in Naples, Rome, the 1st of May in Berlin, waiting for food from the UNICEF. Reading a letter, the orphans from Greece were moved to the islands because they were victims not only of World War II, but also of a civil war. And this is the contact sheet of the image that Tom has showed you with Eleftheria. And it's really like a little movie, putting the shoes on and looking at her feet and exploding into joy. In the 1950s, Szym moved to Europe. He went away from the theater of the Shoah from Eastern Europe, and he would never go back. And this is from a reportage he did with Carlo Levi on the people who didn't know how to read and write and were taught in schools in the south of Italy. This is a man drawing his first alphabet. And one of the numerous postcards that Szym sent his family. And in Rome and Paris, like Tom has showed you, Szym did a lot of celebrity portraits. This is Françoise Sagan just after Bonjour Tristesse was published, her bestseller. This is Peggy Guggenheim and her dogs in Venice. This was used all over the place, including on CD covers and so on. The Calas. Szym wrote to his editor, "I don't like opera, but I think she has a future." This is Szym at the 1956 first big show of Magnum in Germany at the Photokina. And this is part of a big reportage he did on the Vatican. Yeah, you see him photographing with his Rolleiflex here. One of his light-hearted subjects in Italy. And one of his big preoccupations after the war was the state of Israel. He was really emotionally invested in the state of Israel because of his past, of his family's killing and so on. And he went back regularly as of the 1950s. These are all from a kibbutz and dancing the hora. He had still an eye for the girls. And this is a picture reproducing the image that Tom has showed you of Sophia Loren. Vavoom. And you see him reflected photographing Ingrid Bergman, who was a big friend of his. This is the future Paul VI at the Vatican. And this is the filming of Funny Face with Richard Avedon. Szym with Marilyn Monroe. Konrad Adenauer, another contact sheet. And then in 1956, after photographing the starlets and the beginning of Cinecittà, Shim heard the news that there was a war between Egypt and Israel, and he insisted on going even though all his friends and colleagues tried to dissuade him. This is a picture he did. He was traveling with Jean Roy, a Paris Match photographer, and Bourlinguer, a man who liked to take risks and took too many. They were photographing the looting of a flour factory, the hospital. Even though he was on the side of Israel, he could see that the civilians were suffering like they always do in a war, and he focused on the Egyptian population. This is a Suez bombed. And then this is the announcement in the newspaper of Jean Roy's death. He was killed with Shim in a jeep as they were going to see an exchange of prisoners at Alcantara, and for some reason didn't stop when they were asked to. So Shim, who was a correspondent of peace, was killed at Whar in November 1956. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Carol. So now we turn to Ben Schneiderman. Ben Schneiderman is a distinguished university professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Maryland, College Park. As the nephew of David Seymour, he will describe Shim's family background from Warsaw and how he moved to Paris in the 1930s, then trace his iconic photos and his tragic death while covering the Suez crisis for Newsweek in 1956. He can best tell us why we are glad Shim was who he was and did what he did.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here and to be known as the nephew of David Seymour. It's really my pleasure and opportunity to thank so many people who over the years have contributed to telling Shim's story and discovering that story. And Carol and Tom Beck are key among them. And my pleasure with working with the Library of Congress curators, with Beverly Brannan, Verna Curtis, Helena Zinkum, and to see that his work will be here. In addition to the first gift of the 110 photos, there'll be another 130 coming soon. So we'll add to the richness of that. I've also been pleased to have donated photos to the UMBC library that Tom runs, and to other archival centers around the world. That's been the job for me and for my sister. It's a pleasure to tell a story. My job will be made easier by many of the photos that have already been shown and stories that have already been told. This is the classic picture of Shim, as pointed out, dressed always elegantly. He was a man of fine tastes. He knew which tailors to go to in Rome, in London, in Paris. He knew which hotels to stay at in Vienna, in Venice, and in Rome. The Hotel Daniele in Venice is still there. The Hotel Inghilterra in Rome is still at the foot of the Spanish Steps. The Café de Magot, where he hung out with the Henri Cartier-Bresson and Robert Capa, are also there. So this classic photo by Elliot Erwitt really encapsulates the story of the serious, playful humanist, as Tom cited. And you've seen already the photos of that epic story of the partnership with Robert Capa and with Henri Cartier-Bresson and George Rogers. One of the remarkable gifts of Magnum was the diversity of their founders. The personalities were really radically different. And for those who currently believe in theories of team diversity, this was a real exemplar of how that worked out in such an exceptional way. Shim was 2 years older than than Kappa, and Shim was already established in Paris when Kappa arrived and taught him as a big brother. And Kappa would say, as Carol mentioned, that it was only Shim's judgment that Kappa cared about. And when they came to Spain, similarly, Shim was sent by Regards. He was already an established photographer. Kappa came as a stringer, and Shim helped him make his reputation with Gerda Taro. Still in Paris here, Shim with his beloved sister, my mother, Halina, Hala Schneiderman, and then the one on the lower right is probably taken by Shim with my father and mother together. So these are treasures from me, and Shim showed his affection for his sister in these photos, and I think you can see it's the only photo we have where Shim signed it on the bottom. So it says Shim in 1935. In those days, photographers didn't sign their photos, but this was a gift to leave with his sister. You've seen some of the identity cards from his days. I still have in that box that Carol described are his Sorbonne student cards, and then his early press cards, 35, for the Polish Jewish newspaper that he represented, as well as many others, and then the photo wrap that Carol mentioned. He photographed the Front Populaire in these very well-known photos, and you know, it sort of teaches you the art of visual recognition, the representation, the socialists, you know, raised hand. You have to understand the distinction between that and, of course, the Nazi raised fist. And I think that's kind of the things that the students of today need to learn to distinguish and understand those bits of history. We've already seen these photos, Shim's participation in the action, but also his focus on the personal stories. And as Carol and Tom has shown you, this picture, of course, is one of the classic Shim pictures. Time Life puts it in their book of 100 most important photos of the 20th century. This captures the heroic individual, and when the Mexican Suitcase arrived in New York in December 2007, it showed us the original negative where Shim showed the context, the socialist masses, which were really, I think, more central to his theme. So we see again how photos can be interpreted and used in different ways. The photo at the labor rally, as was correctly said by Tom and Carol, was often described as a German bombing event because it was used on the front cover of a magazine with a picture of a German plane dropping bombs, completely independent events, but in that time the sort of manipulation of photography and the sort of the let's say freedom that they used to tell their stories was probably less acceptable, was more acceptable then than it is today. Shim then came to the U.S., as Carol said, and here we see him in his U.S. Army outfit. He was trained right outside here in Camp Ritchie, Fort Ritchie, right outside of Hagerstown, which was where U.S. intelligence officers were trained. And so there's a D.C. story as well. And here he writes in this photo to Lucy, among his girlfriends, starting a ride to the future. We've seen these pictures from his 1947 story. And again, I think the compelling thing for all of us is the way Shim was able to make a relationship. You can imagine what happened in the 30 seconds before the photo, and hear how he managed to get 20 energetic boys to focus and pay attention. Every one of them looking at the camera, not posing falsely, not smiling in a false way, but genuinely being a partner in telling their story. The Tereshka, of course, another one of the Shim iconic photos that grows in importance, much like the Che Guevara image grows in importance. It's been used in dozens of book covers about trauma, orphans of war. Here, a Cambridge University book on culture and under siege, collective violence and trauma. And the kind of stories that happen to me, I get emails. So one of them was of a German philanthropist who tells me his story, and he's founding a orphanage in Africa for the victims of war in Africa. And he would like to call his foundation the Tereshka Foundation. And could he use this photo to represent work he's doing? Of course, I said yes, and that's the way these photos travel. They gain significance and they gain value. They become ways that we think of the emotional parts of our history. He continues and becomes this well-respected photographer for Life magazine, for Look magazine, also in the collection of Library of Congress, becomes advocate for Israel, telling the story. This one on the right, Italian kibbutz, the father and the baby girl were tracked down by the BBC, and story was told in 1996 exhibit and film about Shim. And this kind of perfect moment of Shim capturing a wedding under a Jewish chuppah in Israel, held up with a pitchfork and a gun. That's the kind of symbolism and Shim's capacity to win the favor of people and become a participant in this wedding and to tell the story with great symbolism and great sympathy for the people. You've already seen and heard about the Toscanini, Berenson, Picasso stories. So Shim became the favored photographer because he helped people tell their stories. It wasn't Shim's photo, it was their photo that he was showing. The Peggy Guggenheim you've seen, but another one of the phone calls I get from Magnum, New York says, Ben, great news. The Peggy Guggenheim picture is going to be used for a new Broadway show about Peggy Guggenheim. I said, great, Diana, that's wonderful. Why are you calling me? She said, well, there's a couple of problems. They'd like to colorize this photo. Now, Magnum has a very strict no editing, no manipulation, no changing. Even if they put a title across the top, I get to approve that. So they say it's going to be colorized by John Ritter, an artist I knew. And I said, wow, what an idea. I said, well, okay, but make sure that the caption links to the website and tells the story and shows the original and so on. They said, okay, there's one more problem. I said, okay, what's that? They'd like to substitute the face of Peggy Guggenheim with the face of the actress Mercedes Ruehl. I said, oh my gosh, I've never seen that before. But recognizing that that's the way culture reshapes, repurposes, reinvents, and integrates old into new. And so I said, okay, but I have a request also, 4 tickets for Saturday night. And Jenny, my wife, and I went to New York for that, and that's the picture and the poster that was all around New York in the bus stops and on the buses of Mercedes Ruehl with the pink dog from Peggy Guggenheim and the sort of garish colors, but that's the story as it was, and I just love that story. Sophia Loren, you've seen already. Shim became the favored photographer for the Hollywood pictures being made in Europe, and the Sophia Loren, classic among those. You can see by now, for purposes of Hollywood, he's shifted to the Rolleiflex, the higher medium resolution 6 by 6 centimeter negatives, giving you the kind of quality images. But this image, which is not too bad here, but not too great, these were faded. And 20 years ago, the folks at Magnum said, you know, Shim's Kodachromes, they're really faded badly. We can't use them. We're going to throw them out. Do you want them? I said, okay, send them to me. Let me think about them. And they sat for 10 years till Tom came to look at them. And he looked at them and he said, you know, this was about 2004. And Tom said, you know, this digital photography is digital manipulation is a chance. And I've got a good buddy in Baltimore. We're going to work on them. So he took 4 of them and went to work and made, in his book, there are 4 color images, the first ever published in color. And it's a good job, but Philip Brookman in 2006 at the Corcoran said, well, I can do better. And he spent about a half a day each to redo 14 of those color images and made even better quality images, and then made them as part of his exhibit in 2006 at the Corcoran. Ingrid Bergman was one of the important subjects. She always invited Shim to photograph, and on the website you'll see the letter that she writes to Shim, I make beautiful babies, you make beautiful photos. And so she always wanted Shim to come and tell the story. Joan Collins, Kirk Douglas, And it goes on. You've seen already the Maria Callas and Marilyn Monroe. So Shim traveled. This is at the 21 Club in New York. Shim traveled in these really elegant circles and became a really central person in photography. Now, another key figure he photographed is me. That's right. On West 93rd Street at the statue of Joan of Arc with my mother and my sister. And so I have these warm memories of this uncle who came and brought me gifts and toys. And of course, what I remember was the great love my mother had for her younger brother. And most strongly in 1956, when I was 9 years old, the morning news bringing the terrible tragedy to my mother of the death of her brother. I think I didn't register what the news was, but I registered the trauma that my mother experienced, and that remains strong with me. My mother worked all her life to preserve and promote the work of her brother, and I continue that. My mother lived wonderfully to age 96. In 2004, my mother and father were journalists, and their website is at the University of Maryland that tells their story. So Shim's End was another tragic one. You've heard that, and this is often shown as the last photo, but I received another email from this paratrooper, now age 73, living in Australia, who said, "I have your uncle's last photo." And he says, Shim drove up with Jean Roy in a Jeep. I gave Shim my camera and said, "Would you take a picture of me and my buddy in our foxhole?" He did, gave him back the camera, drove off, and 20 minutes later heard the gunfire. That was Shim's tragic ending. And so that's the burial in the field at near Suez. Shim's casket with the American flag, Jean Roy with the French flag. And you see the soldiers around that event. Ben Bradley, I should say, who died a few weeks ago only, was with Shim the night before he died. And Bradley, in his memoirs, writes 4 pages about this episode and says, Shim went, and it just brings chills to my back. He said, few hours later, Shim was dead. It could have been me, too. And he was, close. And when I met Bradley, he gave me this warm hug. As wherever I go, to be known as Shim's nephew brings me the kind of warmth and greetings that are very special. So Shim lives on in his work, his book on the Vatican, the small early book that captured his photos, Inga Bondi's coffee table version from 1996, Tom's 2004 book that if you take a look at that book, read the captions. It's rare to say it, but with such deftness and in-depth, Tom wrote about each of these photos in such a deep, thoughtful way that captured not only the photographic history and but also told the story of those photos in a vital way that I think is just remarkable. It's rare to say the captions are great. The story's great too up front, but each photo gets such nice attention. Then ICP and the Mexican Suitcase. Cynthia Young deserves hero rewards here also for arranging the exhibit and the magnificent book, which documents all 5,000 negatives and tells the story of every day of where Shim went and where Kappa went. Then the later exhibit on Shim alone. I should say at this point, probably I see Mark Levitch is here, but Mark wrote a wonderful text about Shim, very thoughtful historical one for the National Gallery of Art, where I've also donated a set of Shim prints under the care of Sarah Greeno, but it's Mark who wrote this wonderful text and tells that story as well. And so we come just to the more recent works. Cynthia Young makes the catalog for the book, for the exhibit that was in New York. And Carol does hero duty in going back to the 260 rolls of film from the UNESCO 1947, finding yet another 50 great photos and telling that story. So with each kind of episode, we learn more about what Shim did and what was the impact. And that UNESCO book was given, many people see that as one of the important features that for the American public justified the Marshall Plan. The idea of rebuilding Europe, rebuilding Germany, a challenging idea, but Shim's photos helped to say there was an important job for America to do in that context. And so we have the UNICEF people putting together the Children of Europe, and there's a couple of videos on our website, and Carol's recent books in French. We hope soon to be in English, Carol. The photo push, small books, and then the extensive biography just published earlier this year by Contre-Jour in Paris, La Vie de Shem, as she's already described, and the website where you can find out more. We're actually struggling with a technical problem about the 700, 600 scanned pages. They're coming back soon, but we've had some troubles with getting them back there, but that's the basis, and that brings us to this story, and maybe today's event, which is right here. But actually, there's more. The best is yet to come. It's great to be able to end a talk by saying the best is yet to come and mean it. So you may know of the series, the television series Downton Abbey, which was such a success in the last few years. The producers, Carnival Productions, next series will be 10 one-hour stories of the founding of Magnum. And this just is an amazing story. So the four representatives of the estates, for Kappa, it's ICP. For Henri Cartier-Bresson, it's his foundation in Paris. And in George Roger, his surviving wife, Jinx Rogers. And I represent a living connection with Shim, with Kappa, with Roger, and with Henri Cartier-Bresson. A remarkable story that's going to be told in an amazing way. I can't wait to see it, and hope you'll enjoy that also. But it just tells you how the good deeds that each one of us do can carry on, can make an impact. These guys believed that a photo could change the world, just as now we believe a tweet could change the world. In those days, they believed a photo could change the world, and sometimes they succeeded in changing the world. And it's great to be part of that heritage. I feel just very special to be here with all of you today and to have this gift for the Library of Congress. I spent a sabbatical year in 1996 working for Dr. Billington. It was one of the great experiences of my life, so I'm well-versed with many of the good deeds that happen in this building, and I'm so, so happy that Shim's work will be part of this and that all the goodwill of the people who work here will contribute to telling that story. Thank you all so much. So much. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.